In this section, we will discuss network operating system installation. Before we install the operating system on the server, we should first verify that the server has sufficient RAM, that it has enough CPUs, that there is sufficient hard disk space on the server, and that the server is compatible with the operating system. After we've verified those things, then we get the DVD and we do the install. To perform the install, we take the installed DVD and we put it in the D drive and we turn the computer on. And when we do that, we boot to the DVD, which initiates the installation. So let's do it. We turn the computer on, and now it's booting, and now we see attempting to boot from DVD, press any key to boot from the CD or DVD. So this is where we press any key, and when we do, it then boots to the installation DVD and it starts the Windows setup program. And then now we can see here is Windows setup, Windows Server 2012. We select the language, then we click on Next. Then we select the edition that we want to install, the Standard Edition or the Data Center Edition. I will select Data Center Edition and click on Next. Then I accept the licensing agreement and click on Next. And then I specify, am I going to do an upgrade or a custom install? Well, I'm not going to do either. This is a first-time install. It's a clean install. Well, if you're doing a first-time install, then you select custom. There is no button to check off for a first-time install. When you do a first-time install, that is called a custom. So we click on custom, and then I specify the hard disk that I'm going to install the operating system to, and click on Next. And then the contents of the DVD is then copied to the hard disk. And after the contents of the DVD has been copied to the hard disk, then the computer restarts. And when it restarts, it will say, do you want to boot from the DVD? Press any key. Don't do that. We're already done with that part, so don't press any key at this point. And then it boots to Windows Server. So then what we do is we log in as the administrator, and now Windows Server has been installed. Now the next thing to do is to assign a host name and an IP address. So I will go to the Windows Server utility on the bottom left here, and under the Server Manager I select Local Server, and you can see that when I install the operating system, the default computer name is a randomly generated host name. So I need to assign it a host name. So I click on that computer name, and I click on Change to change the computer name, and there's the randomly generated name. So I delete the randomly generated name, and then I type in the host name of this server, which in this case I will call it Server 1. And then I click the More button, and this allows me to type in the DNS suffix, and for us that would be ccbcmd.edu. So then I click on OK, and OK, and OK. And then now what I'm going to do is to configure the IP address. So I will click on the TCP IP and right click on the Ethernet adapter and select Properties. And then if I go to IP version 4 and click on Properties, I can see that this server is a DHCP client, and I could leave it as a DHCP client. But if I want to install, for example, the domain controller, Active Directory on it, then it has to have a static IP address. So in this example, I will assign it a static IP address. Then I will assign it the subnet mask and the IP address of the default gateway and the IP address of the DNS server. Then I click on OK, and that takes care of TCP/IP configuration. And then the only other thing I have to do is to configure the right time zone. So I select time zone, change time zone, select the drop down, and I select -5 hours Greenwich Mean Time. That's us. Click on OK, and OK, and that's it. I am done configuring the server. So to install Windows 2012 Server, you boot to the DVD, copies all the files to the hard disk, then you reboot. Then you do the post-installation tasks, which includes assigning a host name and a DNS suffix, and then assigning an IP address and configuring the time zone. Let's look at selecting the right edition of Windows Server, and you will see that there are 4 editions of Windows Server: Foundation, Essential, Standard, and Data Center. Now, Essential and Foundation are typically going to be used with small businesses, very small businesses of 15 to 25 people. But most of us as network engineers will be using the Standard and the Data Center edition. Standard will work for most medium-sized organizations, but if you really need an operating system for a large and powerful computer, then you would select Data Center. It supports greater hardware and more virtualization than Standard Edition. The Data Center Edition supports a big computer with 64 CPUs and 4 terabytes of RAM, and I would want to use that if I had planned to install multiple virtual machines on that computer. 4 different editions of Windows Server. Let's look at the prices. The Standard Edition is $679. But if you look at the Data Center Edition, $6,000, and that's just the operating system. The Blade server itself cost $120,000. Now let's briefly discuss the Linux/Unix operating system. The Linux operating system was the first operating system I ever used. The Unix operating system was developed at the University of California at Berkeley, and people like it because it is a robust operating system, meaning it does not crash 3 times a day. And it's typically configured using the command line. To create a user, you'll type add user space Bob. To create a group, you'll type add group space sales. To add the user Bob to sales, you'll type add user Bob to sales. This is the command line interface, and that's typically what Unix uses. Now, in 1991, a guy named Linus Torvalds came out with a knockoff on Unix, a near identical copy, which he called Linux. And the reason people like Linux so much is because it is free and it is widely used. But it's really hard to tell the difference between Unix and Linux. In fact, when we say Unix/Linux, we call it that because it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. And then there are other editions of Unix Linux as well. There is Red Hat Linux, and we have a certification program on Red Hat here at CCBC. IBM's Linux, which they run on their IBM computers, is called AIX. And Sun Solaris has a version of Unix as well. In summary, in this section we talked about network operating system installation, and before we install the operating system, we make sure that the server has enough RAM, enough CPU power, and enough hard disk space. Then we boot to the DVD and we copy the files to the server hard disk. Then we reboot and run the post-installation tasks, which include assigning a host name and a DNS suffix, assigning an IP address, and specifying the time zone. We looked at the different editions of Windows Server, and we briefly looked at the Linux/Unix operating system. And this concludes our section on network operating system installation.